All right, guys, we're live for episode 18 of the John Vervaeke Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Watch Party. So if you're coming to this for the first time, which I kind of doubt that is actually happening, because these are kind of hard to jump into, but we do these watch parties every week. Actually, we might be changing the schedule coming up pretty quick, but we'll announce that probably at the end of the discussion because UV and I still need to talk about it. But we do these 9 a.m. PST, 5 p.m. GMT, and then we do a discussion 1 hour later, pretty much 10 minutes after the lecture is finished. We'll take like a little 10-minute break, and then we'll jump into it. You guys can join the call. It's a Zoom call. You can do that by going to futurethinkers.org/discuss. Everyone's welcome. Let's just discuss. There's no stupid questions. And bringing up these subjects in a group discussion actually can really help clarify some of the topics because these are pretty complex topics. I think that's everything. Oh yeah, UV is going to be taking notes at futurethinkers.org/meaningcrisisnotes. Check in with that. That really helps clarify a lot of things. And I think we're pretty much ready. So let's get into it.
Welcome back to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So last time we were taking a look at a group of people. As I said before, the Gnostics shouldn't be understood as forming like their own community or group, although there might have been some Gnostic churches. We should think of them more like we think of existentialism or fundamentalism. You can be a fundamentalist Christian or Muslim or Jew, etc. It's more about a style, a way of being, a way of understanding and interpreting, and that it was pervasive during the same period as early Christianity, and the two are interacting with each other. In fact, as we'll see, many Gnostics thought of themselves as Christians. So we were taking a look at how to go about interpreting Gnosticism. Why are we doing this? We're doing this because I'm presenting the Gnostic movement as the axial revolution within the axial revolution. It's taking the revolution to its culmination in many important ways that I think have direct relevance for us today. In order to do that, I'm presenting to you something like the cognitive science of what Gnosis actually is. And in order to do that, we've been making use of some important work by Harry Frankfurt and L.A. Paul. The basic idea is that we can talk about people being existentially trapped, and that is a result of them being existentially stuck. They have inertia. They do not know how to engage the anagoge in order to make a worldview viable to them, and they are existentially indecisive. They are existentially stupefied because they're facing a deep transformative experience and they don't know how to reason their way through it. They don't know if they should do it. And that existential entrapment can be very, very damaging. It can fragment your world and tear apart your agency. And so people can suffer from this in a profound way, which means Gnosticism, as Hans Jonas and other people have seen, is directly relevant to a lot of the modern confrontation with meaninglessness and nihilism, because in the meaning crisis, people also similarly feel deeply existentially trapped. So what is needed? I argued, is a recovery of serious play through the engagement in ritual behavior. This ritual play affords an individual to engage in enactive analogy so that they can get into that liminal state in which they can, in a perspectival and participatory manner, bridge in a very apt way between the world and the self that they are now and the world and the self they want to viably become. That enacted ritual should also afford anagoge. It should afford the transframing, the reciprocal anagogic process by which self and world are transformed such that we can go through the sensibility transcendence, which will make a worldview viable to us. That combination, that ritual combination of enacted analogy and enactive anagoge is empowered by the cognitive flexibility brought on by an altered state of consciousness, hopefully a higher state of consciousness that gives us a sense of the increased realness, the more realness of the world that we are trying to move into. So that higher state of consciousness, as we've talked about before, motivates us to go through this radical transformative experience. Now, of course, there are dangers associated with all of this. When we are engaging in this kinds of radical transformation of our salient landscape, when we are putting ourselves and our world at risk, when we are inducing altered states of consciousness, there is a significant chance that we will fall prey to parasitic processing, to bullshitting ourselves, to deceiving ourselves. And therefore, it is very important, and this is also part of what was going on with Gnosticism, to build up a community, a shared mythology, a shared set of psychotechnological practices, a shared social network of distributed cognition to provide sapiential feedback, guidance, correction, and encouragement for people when they are endeavoring to go through the kind of transformation that will release them from this existential entrapment. So you have some higher state of consciousness, hopefully that has some aspects of being a higher state of consciousness, and that is going to be set within a ritual framing that I've been talking about, and then you want that in turn set within an important sapiential and supportive community that is teaching you all kinds of the relevant skills by which one can bring wisdom, the ability to overcome self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior, to bear upon this transformation. When all of that is the case, this is what Gnosis is. It's this kind of deeply transformative, deep perspectival participatory knowing that is ritually enframed and embedded with a sapiential and supportive community. So, community. So, what do we have going on here is a project that was addressing the domicide, that it was still in existence, persisting from the Hellenistic domicide that we were spoken about. It's also, as I mentioned, one of the reasons why Christianity took root, because while the Roman Empire offered a socio-political solution to some of the problems of the ancient world, it didn't have a viable answer on its own to the meaning crisis, the domicide of the Hellenistic period. Things like Stoicism had been generated. But Christianity is a significant response. And at the same time, this movement, this Gnostic movement arises. Now, these Gnostics, many of them, not all of them, saw themselves as Christians. They interpreted Jesus as somebody who had brought them Gnosis. And for them, the important thing was not to believe in Jesus, but as much as possible to become like Jesus, to go through the kind of radical transformation to be at one with God the way Jesus was. Now, whether or not we believe in that particular mythology, two things we need to note for our purposes in this course. We need to note that Gnosticism and Christianity are deeply talking to each other and informing each other, even though in many ways they'll have an oppositional relationship. we're going to see that both Gnosticism and Christianity are also in a very important dance and intermeshment with Neoplatonism. Now, many people, and I pointed out with the examples of Jeep form and therapy and martial arts, right? Many people are seeking Gnosis today because Gnosis is the kind of thing you need in order to bring about a release from the existential entrapment that we're finding in the meaning crisis. Now, what's interesting about the Gnostics is they create a mythology for all of this. And I think the best, because if you just read their stuff, it's like, man, it's like if you were strung out on an incredible acid trip and everybody was speaking in reverse. It is so hard. Their stuff is so bizarre and weird and strange. But I think if you pay attention to some of the main themes of the mythology, you can see how it is a mythological scaffolding for bringing about Gnosis. A book I would recommend to you is April DeConnick's book, The Gnostic New Age. In that, she does some good work at bringing out some of the central themes of this movement. And she also points out how much Gnosticism is prevalent in our culture today, mythologically. And you may say, what do you mean by that? Well, many movies, and she shows this in the book, actually have a Gnostic theme. The mythology of the movie, and movies are where we go to play with a lot of our mythology, actually are pretty clear versions of this Gnostic mythology. So what is this mythology? So the Gnostics have an idea, and you can see part of it comes from Plato. There's an influence from Plato. So if you remember, Plato has this idea about the everyday world, right? The everyday world is a world like the shadows and the echoes. These things are not fully real. This table, this wall, this pen, they're in a profound sense images, right? They participate in the forms. You remember those patterns of intelligibility and realness. So Plato had a problem, which is the forms are basically eternal. So if you think of something like, E equals mc squared, right? That's not an event. It's sort of timeless and spaceless. And then how do these eternal forms, how do they express themselves in the temporal things, the things that are changing here? So basically, how do time and eternity intersect? And so Plato proposed a mythological answer. He proposed that there was a figure, he called the figure the craftsman, the demiurge. And what the demiurge is he can sort of become aware of these because he's a rational agent. And then what he does is he shapes things in space and time in order to make the world of becoming have some reality to it. And so it has some important similarities to the eternal world. And that means that by paying attention to temporal events, we can become aware of these eternal principles, sort of what science does right now. Now, whether all of that is true, I think in an important sense it's not true. There's a mythological point here. Plato is trying to understand mythologically the relationship. He's trying to give us a way in imagery and story of understanding the relationship between eternity and time. Now, the Gnostics were influenced by this, but they took this notion and they did something very interesting to it. Because they said the temporal world, the everyday world we're in, is a world of very significant suffering. So remember, they're after the Hellenistic domicide. They're during a period both where the Hellenistic domicide is still in existence and the Roman Empire has caused massive pain and suffering throughout the world. So they're looking at the everyday world and they're seeing all this suffering. They're feeling deeply trapped within it, existentially trapped, in the way we've been talking about. So for them, that was very clear evidence that whoever had created this world was either stupid or evil or both. They were looking around the world and saying, look at how much we suffer. Look at how much pain we're in. Look at how much we're trapped. And therefore, whatever is creating the structures that we're living in is both stupid and evil. So in Plato, the demiurge is basically a beneficent being, but in here, the demiurge very often becomes something like an evil overlord. Now, what's going on here? Well, what they're trying to do is articulate, again, the sense of being trapped, and that the socioeconomic, sociocultural, political economic structures that they find themselves in are actually thwarting them. And now when I say it that way, it's like, oh, maybe that's a mythological way of talking about something that you might be experiencing. You're experiencing existential entrapment, and then when you look out at the patterns of your culture, the patterns, right, the market patterns, the political patterns, you don't feel like they are shaping a world that is going to help alleviate your entrapment. Instead, you feel that they are stupid and evil. And I know from a lot of the research we did for the book on zombies with the work I did with Chris and Philip, more and more people view their myths, their deeply repeated cultural, political, socioeconomic patterns, not as helping them, but as thwarting their efforts to be free from their existential entrapment, adding to their fragmentation and their suffering. So whether or not we believe in the Gnostic supernaturalistic way of talking about this, which I don't, we can nevertheless understand what they are articulating. We have this existential entrapment, and we have socio-political, socio-cultural patterns that are designed to further that entrapment, further our self-deception, further our self-destruction, keep us enmeshed in modal confusion, or keep us awashed in parasitic processing, keeping us trapped, stuck, and stupefied. So for the Gnostics, right, they needed to try and link this to existing mythologies. And here's where they did something that is radical. They identified all the existing gods, whether it's the god of the Jews or the god of the Romans. Instead of seeing these gods as divine beings, they saw these gods as basically the guards of our prison. So they see everything else that people had thought of as previously sacred, all the gods, as actually things imprisoning us. Even Paul was talking about this in the Bible, where he talks about powers and principalities that keep us imprisoned. Now, I want you to stop and pause, because this is a radical idea. This is an idea that there has been something common to all of these gods that must now be challenged. So up until now, right, the relationship between us and them was one of servitude, often bordering on notions of slavery. We were the slaves or the servants of the gods. The Gnostics want to invert that. They want to tell you that instead of worshiping these gods, instead of idealizing these gods, instead of giving in to these powers and principalities, these patterns that are pervasive and profound in the way they entrap us, instead of thinking how we should serve and fit into them. Think of this again. Remember the axial revolution. Don't try and fit into the everyday world. You want to transcend it. Instead of serving and fitting in, we have to transcend them all. They are not divine. They are our prison guards. They may be powerful, but instead, what we need to realize is that there is something in us, they thought of it as a divine spark, that will actually carry us above, to the God beyond all gods, which sounds like a contradiction, because, of course, that's what they're trying to get at. The idea here can be expressed using some of the Christian mythology that they were quite willing to. Well, it depends who you're talking to. If you're an Orthodox Christian, you see the Gnostics as perverting your mythology. If you're a Gnostic, you see yourself as disclosing by transformation what's actually available in the mythology. So, for the Gnostics, this God is the God of the Old Testament. Evil, jealous, vindictive, right, who threatens and bullies people, authorizes genocide, shows favoritism for no moral reason, is just and I mean, think about he says, the God of the Old Testament, I'm a jealous God. Don't you dare worship anybody other than me, right? And if you do, I'll kill you, and I'll kill your kids, and I'll kill your kids' kids, and all this horrific stuff. And then that God is compared to the God of the New Testament, the God of agape, the God of light and love. And the idea is that God, who's the God beyond all gods, does not want our worship, wants us to reunite with him. He wants us to, or she wants us to fully participate. I have to say he and she specifically for the Gnostics is one of the things they also challenged was the difference between the genders in the ancient world. They're famous for that, of thinking women are as equally capable of a spiritual life as men. So, we are radically not at home because our capacity for agapic love means we have a Gnostic potential. We have the power, the potential to remember, to know that we belong here. We can sense that we don't belong here. We can sense that we belong somewhere else. We know there's something fundamentally wrong here. And then the idea is this God beyond all gods, this absolute fullness of being, sends individuals down into the world of suffering to bring us the Gnosis, to bring us this kind of transformative knowledge that will set us free. And what the Gnostic Christians did is they said Jesus was this individual. So the Gnostics don't put a huge emphasis on the person of Jesus and his crucifixion. Instead, the teachings of Jesus are much more important to them. Because what is going to happen here is Jesus is going to bring us the way of knowing, gnosis of agape, so that we can free ourselves from this. So the Gnostics, therefore, don't see the purpose of Christianity as doctrine or dogma. The purpose of it is to give us a mythology that will free us from our existential suffering and allow us to experience this transcendence of the gods. Now this inversion, right, this radical inversion, it's like, that's what I mean, it's the culmination, it's the axial revolution that is finally applied to even to the whole mythological framework of the ancient world. And what it means is the Gnostics have a very, and this is one of the things that their critics often leveled against them, the Gnostics keep churning out new gospels and new stories and new myth, because for them it's not about having a final orthodox story, a final orthodox set of principles. It's about having engaged in, participated in the process of creating the inactive analogies, the enacted anagoge. That's what matters. That's what actually matters. Now, this idea that spirituality is ultimately about transcending the gods rather than serving the gods is very both pertinent to us today and very radical for its time, because you have basically the challenging of not even a belief, it was just an unquestioned presupposition that our relationship to the gods was one of servitude and slavery, getting transformed into, no, the core of spirituality is not worship. The core of spirituality is self-transcendence. Healing and freeing people from existential entrapment and their suffering. And that our mythology and our practices should always be in service of us reuniting to who and what we are. Now we love this story. Notice how, first of all, it's still got all the Platonic elements. Here are the people trapped in the cave. They're bound. They get the secret knowledge, right, that frees them so that they can return to and see the light, right? But of course, for Plato, you come back down into the cave. For the Gnostics, you try to spread the message to as many people as you can. So it has the Platonism. It, of course, has a way of connecting that Platonism to Christianity by reinterpreting Jesus as the embodiment of Gnosis rather than as a sacrifice in whom we should have faith. Jesus is a teacher who provides us with something like what the shaman did and what our therapist does, provides us with the keys to unlocking, right? Unlocking all the ways in which these patterns, these sociocultural, political, economic patterns, ways of thinking and being, are just permeated into layers of our psyche and ways of being in the world, that they just exacerbate our suffering, our existential entrapment, and the way it is fragmenting our world and ripping apart our agency. So we long for that now. This was Hans Jonas' great insight. We long for that now. So we go to movies that show this, right? So DeConnick goes through several movies that are basically modern portrayals of this Gnostic mythology. Of course, famously, and it brings all of these elements in. The Christian, the Platonic, and the Gnostic, of course, is the Matrix, right? Because the Matrix is this. You're entrapped in a world of illusion. There are evil overlords who are trying to keep you entrapped so you don't ever discover who you truly are, right? But you know, remember there's a scene in the movie, like a splinter in your mind that there is something wrong and you don't belong, right? That's the Matrix. Or you can see a movie starring Jim Carrey, The Truman Story. Notice, of course, the play on words there. Right? Truman, discovering who you really are. And he grows up in a world right, with an overlord that has manufactured it to keep him from ever actually getting his true agency, finding true love, etc. And what he has to do is get the knowledge in order to get beyond this God. We keep telling this story because it's a myth, because it keeps pointing us to patterns that are pervasive and profound and powerful. And we can't quite articulate them and we can't quite know them. But the myth at least gives us a moment of, right, at least narrative and symbolic recognition of our suffering. So the Gnostics are offering a radical form of the Exo Revolution. Now it carries with it a dark side. As I keep showing you with all of this stuff, the light side and the dark side of Christianity, right? And you probably could see how there's a Gnostic element also within Star Wars. You're trapped within the Empire with the evil overlord, the Emperor, and you have to get free, and you need to have the knowledge of the Force that will set you free, and blah, 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 blah. Like, we love this, and we keep wanting to do it. That's great. What's the dark side of the Gnostic vision? The dark side of the Gnostic vision is it doesn't have to, and many of the original Gnostic writers that I've read it's not the case, but it can do this. Okay. This is ultimately a conspiracy theory. This is a grand conspiracy theory. That behind, look, one of the reasons why this is comforting is behind all the apparent chaos and suffering, there actually is some evil overlord. I mean, one of the things that would make evil so much more tractable for us is if it was ensconced within an individual. But this is the ultimate conspiracy theory. There's a whole system that is keeping you from realizing the truth and who you truly are, the true man that you are, and how you belong elsewhere and living another way. And now you say, oh, well, conspiracy. Well, stop and think. Look, what are the Gnostics saying? This evil overlord. Some of them say, not all of them, it's the same as the God of the Old Testament. Who are the people that worship the God of the Old Testament? The Jews. Here's an idea that's now being sown into Western culture. The Jews are part of a conspiracy to keep us from realizing our true heritage. And that is going to turn out to be an extraordinarily dangerous and bloodthirsty idea. Nazism is a twisted, and other people have pointed this out, Nazism is not primarily a political or even a socioeconomic movement. Nazism is a twisted Gnostic response of the meaning crisis that was being magnified in the Weimar Republic of Germany. So there is a dark side to Gnosticism. So we should have an ambivalent attitude towards it. In order to understand it, we must think of how we can extricate Gnosis from Gnosticism. How can we salvage Gnosis from Gnosticism? Just like how can we salvage agape from Christianity? How can we salvage wisdom from the ancient nomological order? So on one side, right, you can see the dangers. Why did this happen? It's a long, complicated story, but part of the problem, part of the reason is The emerging Orthodox Church, it wasn't even an Orthodox church at that time, it called itself the Apostolic Church, the church that thought Jesus was absolutely unique, right, and the point was to worship him, and that faith is what was crucial, faith in the sense of believing in him as a sacrifice, persecuted. And I mean that literally, persecuted the Gnostic form of Christianity and drove it underground. And as underground, it became enmeshed with any type of group that was trying to challenge the established order. And that's how it tends to surface again in Nazism. We'll see there are more things that feed into Nazism, but that's all we need for right now. Gnosticism, of course, is also deeply influential in some very important people. So here are three people we're going to start talking about more and more. You've already heard me talk about Tillich. Tillich is one of the great theologians. Tillich talks about the meaning crisis in a classic book that I highly recommend to you called The Courage to Be. And he talks about that the response to that is a way of discovering, and it's clear because of how he talks about symbols, and he talks about transformation, although he does not use the term, but he's talking about gnosis. He's talking about that the response to the meaning crisis is the gnosis of the God beyond the God of theism. That what we need to do is discover the God, who of course is not a God, because it's the God beyond the God of theism. As the meaning crisis destroys the mythology of, right, the theistic the mythology of God, can we rediscover sacredness in a way that liberates us from our existential suffering? This is the core. Now, Tillich thought that Christianity could play a significant role in that, and one of my friends and colleagues, Jonathan Pajot, thinks that Christianity will, in fact, go through this kind of self-transformation so that it can move beyond the meaning crisis. I'm not convinced of this, but I do respect these points. Many of you have heard me already mention Jung. Jung basically was deeply Jung is to Gnosticism what, cognitive behavioral therapy is to Stoicism. Jung is basically a transformation into psychotherapeutic context, the Gnostic mythology. And you should understand why that is not a coincidence. The Gnostic mythology is a way, right, of giving us a scaffolding for inactive analogy, inactive anagoge, which of course are so central to therapeutic processes. The person you haven't heard me mention, and I'll talk about more later, is Corbin. Corbin was very much about trying to recover this kind of knowing, because his great concern was that we had lost this kind of knowing, and therefore we had lost our capacity for the transformation and the liberation that it can bring about. And we can get trapped in these historical patterns that fragment our world and tear apart our agency. So, because they represent the radicalization of the axial revolution, there is much to learn from Gnosticism, but I am not advocating an attempt to resurrect it or bring it back. What we need to do is understand, and that's what these individuals represent, and notice that at least one of them was one of the most courageous opponents of the Nazis. Tillich was the first non-Jewish academic to be fired from the Nazis, because from the very beginning and consistently he identified them and resisted them. So keep this whole framework in mind. Can we salvage from Gnosticism Gnosis and some of its radical message about how we can reconfigure, how we can have a non-theistic, non-supernaturalistic understanding of sacredness? Can we do that and avoid the conspiratorial way of thinking that can be so damaging and has been? See, one of the things that Gnosticism can quickly allied into, right, is that those utopian, they're so enticing, right? Those utopian ideologies that give you the great conspiracy theory and tell you that you belong to the chosen few, the chosen race or the chosen class, right? And and violence is acceptable because the system is evil and must be destroyed. I point you to the work of Chris Hedges, because he's criticized both sides, right? He wrote a book, American Fascists, about fundamentalist Christianity and its pervasive, right, portrayal of a grand conspiracy. But he also wrote a book on the new atheists and how they also represent a utopic perfectionism that sanctions violence. And if you don't believe me, take a look at Hitchens and Harris and the proposals for nuclear first strikes against the Islamic world, etc. So, I'm suggesting to you, and I'm trying to give you an argument for it, how we should have an ambivalent attitude towards Gnosticism. Let's put it back in the historical picture, because I told you about the three that are crucial and how they're intermessed with each other. We have the emerging Christianity. We've seen this by taking a look at, right, Jesus and John and Paul. And we've seen how it's interacting with Gnosticism. We've already seen how Gnosticism is influenced and influencing Platonism. And in particular, I want to look at Neoplatonism, because it is also deeply enmeshed with Christianity. This triangle is going to be necessary for understanding the final elements of the orders of meaning, the grammar of, as I've put it before, of meaning. We've got the nomological order. What is Neoplatonism? By the way, Neoplatonism is also why the main character in the Matrix is called Neo, for Neoplatonism, and he's often referred to as the One, because the One is the central thing within Neoplatonism. Again, there's a reason why all of these mythological patterns keep being so attractive to us. So, Plotinus, let me give you an analogy. I think this is a helpful analogy. Scientists right now are trying to integrate quantum mechanics and relativity, the two great theories. And if they come up with it, they'll have the grand unified theory. Einstein tried and failed. Many people think they've had an answer, and then it collapses. By analogy, Plotinus is the grand unified field theory of ancient spirituality. Because what does he do? Well, he takes Plato's spirituality. He takes the whole idea of anagoge, right, from Plato. He takes Aristotle's theory, the whole Aristotle worldview, the theory of knowing, right, the theory of the structure of the world. We've talked about that. And he takes from the Stoics that whole therapeutic project, right? Overcoming modal confusion. And what he does is he integrates them together. He integrates them together in a powerful way. How does he do that? Well, he talks about, first of all, he says, well, you can start anywhere. You can start in any one of these places in Plotinus' writing and then get to the other two. It is such a powerfully integrated system. And when you're reading Plotinus, it's not like when you're not just reading an argument, you're also undergoing a spiritual exercise that is trying to transform your state of consciousness and your cognition. So, what's the main theory here? Let's start here. So, if you remember, you have Aristotle's conformity theory. We know something, right? Remember this, by conforming to it, by sharing the same structural functional organization with it, right? And then Plotinus says, oh, wait a sec, Aristotle also has sort of levels of being. And we talked about this. We talked about at the lowest level, right, there's pure potentiality, and at the highest level, there's pure actuality. And we don't need to get into the metaphysics, but here's the idea. There are levels of reality, levels of realness. As we know, and this doesn't mean intellectual, this is participatory. This is very much like Gnosis, and he's in discussion with Gnosis. We know that Plotinus has Gnostic students. He's also critical of them, but this is not just intellectual knowing. This is deeply participatory knowing. As we make these, listen to my language, as we make these levels of reality viable to us, as they become livable to us, right, we conform to them and we change. And this is Eric Pearl's brilliant idea, right? All of his stuff is so good, right? As we conform and make this level of reality real to us, we're conforming to it, and we're also moving to a higher level of the self. As we conform, we're also altering, and this is the anagoge of Plato, right? We're altering what level the self is at. And of course, as we alter the level that the self is at, we're more capable of living in that higher level of reality. What this does for us is it helps us deeply remember the being mode, who we really are. Let me try and put this all together with an example. What is it that makes something real? I mean, think about this. Think about Socrates here. Right? Socrates, what do you mean by real? We care about whether or not things are real. It really matters to us. Look at the word really. It really matters to us. And yet, what is it that makes something real? How much time have you put into that? Because if you are driven by a pursuit of realness and you don't understand what it is, if it's something you're pursuing and you don't understand, remember what that is? That's the gap of bullshit. Okay, so what makes something real? Well, and notice for Plotinus, and again, Eric Pearl, especially in his book, Thinking Being, just a fantastically brilliant book. Can't recommend it enough, right? But it's not what makes something real, it's how do we also sense it as real? So it's both what structurally, functionally organizes it to be real, two sides of the worldview, and how do we sense it? How does it make us be able to sense it as real? And here's the answer. And in some sense, it's basic, but in another sense, it's profound. What makes something real is how one it is, how integrated it is, how much it is structurally, functionally organized. So we treat the object as more real than the shadows because it's more structurally, functionally organized. That's talking about the object. What is it to understand something? Well, here's a bunch of separate things, and when I understand them, I find how they're all one, how they can all be integrated together. When I understand something, I understand how all of its parts are integrated together. And then what we do is, okay, these things have been integrated here, and then, oh, and I can integrate these here, and this is more real. What's one behind all of these variant things, and then I can, of course, find what's underneath all of this, and what's underneath this, and what's underneath this. Things become more real to us as we integrate them together, and they're more real as things as they are integrated together. So, as we try and find the deeper underlying principles that integrate things together, we become more integrated together. And we become more real. We are realized. We're the object, we're getting to what's more real, and we, as we become more integrated, more actualized, are becoming more real. I'm becoming more integrated, and you can see this is Plato's anagoge, right? The inner conflict within me is being reduced. I'm becoming more real as I'm becoming more integrated. And that is allowing me to make viable and real these more integrated, deeper levels of reality. And then the whole thing spins anagogically. And what I have is I move from where things are only potential, they don't have much form, like in Aristotle, all the way up to as having the greatest structural functional organization they can. And all of this it's not just a theory. It's a change in my existential mode. I am becoming more real. That's why I use the word realization. It's simultaneously a making more real of the world and me, and becoming more aware of what's more real. But what is it? What's down here? Or up, depending on which way you want to draw these lines. What's down? What's here? Well, it's got to be, right, the principle that makes everything else real, that integrates everything together. It can't in any way be multiple. So Plotinus calls this the one. He doesn't mean the single. This is that by which reality is realized and our mind realizes reality. Plotinus uses the metaphor of light. Just like light is itself invisible and makes everything seeable, the one is not anything we can ever know. You can't know the one because it is that by which everything is known. It is that by which everything is. So how do you ever reunite with it? If you can't know it, if it is beyond all possible thought, because thought breaks things apart. If it's beyond all possible, how do you know it? You can't know it. You can't have it. You can't have it even in thought. You can't have it even in the most beautiful theory. You can't have it. You can only be it. You can only have gnosis of the one by being one. So at the height of Plotinus' system is a higher state of consciousness, an awakening experience. But notice, it's completely integrated with the best science and the best scientific psychotherapy of the time. There is no deep division in Plotinus between spirituality, science, and therapy. They are all beautifully, mutually supporting, interwoven, and meshed together. It's the culmination of everything from the Greek axial age. Next time I want to talk about how all of these currents, Christianity, Gnosticism, and Neoplatonism, are going to be taken up by Augustine. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. We're going to take a 10-minute break and then we're going to jump into the discussion. If you can jump into the discussion right now, that'd be awesome. Go to futurethinkers.org/discuss. There's a waiting room in Zoom, and then in roughly 10 minutes I'll show a countdown timer. We'll jump into it and I'll let you guys all into the call. See you in a sec. All right, we're live. How's it going?
Doing all right. Kind of languid.
Languid?
Yeah. A little low on sleep. Just kind of lazy day.
Yeah. That's the same for UV and I. Yeah, hard to follow this one actually with the screaming baby in the background. Seems like he's quiet now though.
That's good.
How's it going, David?
Doing really good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I enjoyed this one. I don't remember getting as much out of this the first time I watched it.
How's it going?
Uh-oh.
Doing all right. Kind of languid.
Languid?
Yeah.
Kira, I just had to mute you there because you've got the YouTube player in the background going. So you just have to close that. So what did you get out of this one?
Something like the Alexander and I were on a call earlier today talking about stuff, and there's something I liked the conversation that started at the end of this. The Gnosis having I don't remember so much.
Somebody else still has the video in the background.
I'll keep an eye out. Just go ahead, David.
Okay. That the Gnosis has both the kind of a positive frame and a negative frame. And the questions that people were asking, that somebody was asking in the thing of is Scientology a form of Gnosticism? And Googled it a little bit, and it's like, yeah, some people say that actually is that L. Ron Hubbard actually claimed that he had invented a Gnostic religion. And it's something of the reciprocal opening and the reciprocal narrowing. That it's interesting because the timing of these of the watch party is interestingly aligned in some ways with some of the other stuff. Like the Rebel Wisdom just recently released a video talking a little bit more about with Vervaeke and the reciprocal opening and the reciprocal narrowing. And it's really powerful to look at that. The reciprocal narrowing for me is kind of going towards certainty and addiction, and reciprocal opening is going towards surrender and a flowering. And in some sense, I think both are essential. I think that that there's not one end of the spectrum that is the best end, and there's not some midpoint that's a good way station in between those. But the fluctuation between the two is kind of important. And so we seem to be at a place where I think the reason there's a meaning crisis altogether, my own sense of it, is because we've gone too much towards the end of certainty, too much towards the end of the propositional, and that the Gnostic embodied sense of awakening from the dream, right, and the awakening from the matrix is an interesting one. But I also agree with somebody in the comment section that I don't think it's some external they, but us as the collective that does that. It's a weird, like if I think about it, it almost breaks my brain to actually think, what is a collective agent that would have us move towards, culture, have us move towards certainty to a greater and greater extent, to the point of breaking that and then kind of doing a 180 and coming back towards embodied Gnostic perspective. But I think that is kind of effectively what happens. So I was particularly interested in the book recommendation, the Eric Pearl one. I want to read that. Like I remember kind of seeing him recommend it before and I haven't read it, and I don't really know that much about Gnosticism, so I am very curious. It makes me want to investigate more.
It's interesting you mentioned certainty, and kind of an overswing towards certainty. It reminds me of our conversation with Douglas Rushkoff, and he was talking about how algorithms like Facebook algorithm and other algorithms try to put people into a box, into a profile, and they actually try to manipulate your behavior so that you would become more predictable, because there are a lot of, they sell that data to companies that use it to sell you stuff, and you know, they're very invested in having certainty, in knowing that you will behave one way or another. So you were saying, what is the thing that kind of pushes us towards certainty? Well, it seems that capitalism definitely favors certainty.
Something that's been on my mind quite a bit lately in terms of that certainty, you know, when we, so much of the underlying metaphor of how we think about the mind is the machine, and John talks about, you know, refers to that quite a bit. And you know, I think culturally, one of the, you know, the idea of, you know, a machine used to be like could be any number of things, from a, you know, steam engine to something else. But now our main idea of a machine is a computer, and our computers are currently binary, black and white. It either something is or it is not. And I think it's going to be interesting you know, I only have a limited understanding of quantum computing, but as we move towards that, as that becomes more of a common, as that becomes more known, you know, that something can be both, and like that certainty, the either or, becomes less of a, it becomes less and more open to both. And because I think that's the thing that it's like, well, it has to be one or the other. It, you know, it has to be someone's fault. It has to be, you know, we have to know, you know, whether it's this or it's not. All of those things, I think, play a role, you know, as the underlying metaphor plays a role in how we interpret this information.
I like that as well. There's, you know, I don't think we have to even really wait for computers to be in the quantum realm. Artificial intelligence is already doing something in that regard, that it's becoming more statistical and probabilistic rather than certain. And it's an interesting. There was an interesting discussion on the AI podcast with Lex Friedman, where he interviewed Jim Keller, who's a chip designer. And it's a really fascinating perspective, because he said that that one of the ways we're starting to generate better performance and continue the route of Moore's law is by looking at probabilistic interdependency charts of the instruction sets. They rather than doing a sequential one instruction after the other, they're pulling in 500 instructions at a time, doing kind of a Bayesian analysis or some sort of artificial intelligence neural network analysis of all these 500 instructions, which instructions can be reliably parallelized in a way to get the maximum flow through of the whole set. And that's the way that chips currently work. It's like that's how those chips are working right now. And it's like increasingly, I think that's kind of what the brain's doing as well. You know, that is effectively what I think relevance realization is. It's looking at a kind of a deep structure of the relatedness of all of this, and throwing away the stuff that's extraneous in order to bring some sense of probabilistic order. And if it's consistent, then we continue in a way that the hallucination is not disrupted. So that there's something like that happens already. There's also something interesting about, back to certainty, which is really kind of interesting, is like, I noted that there's two different ways of kind of understanding something. Like if an example that I gave to somebody was, if I want to understand a puppy, I can understand it relationally, the individual puppy relationally, interacting with it. And I can never really understand the personality of the puppy by dissecting it into its constituent parts. And yet dissecting it somehow gives me an abstraction of puppy that I can have an understanding that I wouldn't be able to have just from the relational. So there's both sides of those, that relational and that transactional. I don't know if the transactional quite fits here, but those two, you know, dissecting the parts, you know, the reductionist view and that holistic view give me very different senses. But the sense of, what my question of what is evil, in some senses, that preferring the certainty so much that I'm willing to kill whatever living thing there is in order to get to certainty. Like, I know for sure what that connection is, but now it no longer has the capacity to function in the way that made it wonderful to begin with.
That relates to that James P. Carr's quote about certainty that I brought up recently. I can't remember if it was on the watch party or on one of the community calls.
What was it?
Let me Google it. It's quite long. Sorry about that. There. Evil is never intended as evil. Evil, indeed, the contradiction inherent in all evil is that it originates in the desire to eliminate evil. Evil arises in the honored belief that history can be tidied up, brought to a sensible conclusion. And then it gives some variations of that, but that's the main idea.
Something's confusing. I'm not muted. First time. Awesome. I did a double check there. Something's confusing me about our tendency to us being kind of, I guess, let's say the Gnostics, tendency of looking out at the social and cultural structures and seeing them as thwarting their progress. I can't really figure it out. Like even the interpretation of the Matrix seemed wrong in that. Like Neo was uncovering the layers of reality in order to wake up from them. To me, the rest of the movie is just happenstance after that. It's just because Hollywood needs we expect in an action drama for there to be a bad guy to fight against. But I mean that the whole analogy of that is most compelling to me is the wake up. And so much of what I'm seeing and what confuses me, I can't figure it out, is that wake up is kind of related to others. Like there's people holding us back. Until we can get rid of those people, we're going to be stifled in our waking up. I'm wondering why that's such a common theme. I can't figure that out right now.
Do you guys think maybe that sense of evil, like I also think a lot about, Jamie Wheel on your podcast talked about, his best attempt would be to open source the tools of self-transcendence ahead of the efforts or ahead of the plans for the Death Star, I think was what he said. And how John also drew all these analogies about in film about conquering the evil force, or whether it's commercialism or whether it's weaponization. But I think maybe that it's our individual structures of fear and self-protection. In other words, self-interest, that if you expand it out into a culture and a society of self-interest or of self-protection or weaponization, it starts becoming or looking more and more evil in its grander scales. But on an individual level, like you personally or myself personally, there are just self-interested, self-protecting, self-protecting mechanisms. So it's not really evil. It's just the other dark, unknown subconscious forces. Just putting it out there.
I like, there's something really interesting about that. I would say this makes me think again to the quote that James P. Carr had that Yuvi said, is that it's it's really an interesting and delicate operation to try to figure out how to circumvent the problematic, right? If I think, oh, we're going to open source the plans before we build the Death Star, that may actually be the thing that gives the plans to Lord Vader, right? That actually may be, it's like, oh, can we jumpstart that? Does it have to come through? If we try to figure out how to create a certainty around the transformation, then we've actually enabled ourselves to go down the rabbit hole of, shit, I think I just shot myself in the foot. It almost has to come about as an individual awakening, which is a very funny kind of a thing. And in this way, what makes sense for me when looking at the Matrix trilogy as a whole is that Neo and his waking up is transitioning from the larval stage of human being to the embodied stage of human being, coming out of the larva and the enclosed matrix in which everything is just a consumptive kind of loop, to now there's an expressive whole, and I'm actually working in concert with the machine world. I'm not fighting the machine world. The machine world wasn't really trying to entrap me. It really was nurturing me to the point of maturation that I could escape my cocoon and participate more fully as the one, but also the one is including the machine. It's not me versus the machine. It's me and the machine.
Yeah.
That
I like
resonated with a model of mine, actually, that I've been enjoying. I've had it come up a number of times where I've found situations where I went to thinking of it as, oh, I've been hanging out in the game B scene a lot, so I've been kind of using phrasing associated with that, and the idea that denigrating the machine, or in the game B scene, game A, the vehicle that's already there, it's the vehicle that gets us to the liminal space. If I drive cross country and head due east or due west in the US, I'm eventually going to hit a big body of water where that vehicle, car, truck, etc. type vehicle is no longer going to carry me forward. I hit a liminal space, a beach, a shore, and a vast expanse of water, and my car doesn't suddenly become evil because it's not a boat. Okay, it's just time to think about boats or airplanes or some other form of vessel, and I can still give thanks to that vehicle having gotten me to where I'm at.
Yeah.
Good analogy.
Yeah.
That brings me back to the phrase that helped me through a lot of some of my really dark night of the soul type moments was, everything is perfect exactly the way it is, and it can't stay that way. Because I needed to constantly be reminded that this moment is perfect exactly the way it is, because there's absolutely no way it could be different. And this moment's going to teach me how to be different in the next moment and in the next. But that reminder of, and so when I hear people get bad mouthing Facebook and stuff like that, I'm like, it's a tool that's getting, it's what's needed right now, because it's what's emerged. There is no way that it's not. I mean, it's a tool, and how you use it is very different. I have people who talk about their experience of it, and I'm like, I don't have that experience. Maybe that's just because I know how to cultivate the type of experience that I want to have on it. And going back to something that you said, if you were asking a little while ago, the two future thinkers, I forget your names, I'm sorry.
Mike and Yuvi. You can mouse over our faces. I do that all the time so that I can know who I'm talking to.
You were asking about why do we think that we can't do it with the people around us, because it's always so easy to blame. If I point the finger at you, then I don't have to look at how am I participating in creating the environment, the situation that I'm in. And I think that our social media and all of that stuff is a perfect example, because if you spend, it's a good tool, even if it's not perfect. It helps me find things like this. So it's an amazing tool.
It's always a lot easier to point fingers than to take responsibility, and it's there are a lot of different frameworks that point this out, developmental frameworks, and for example, the transition from the socialized mind to the self-authoring mind, I think in Keegan, where, you know, socialized mind is like very much us versus them, like, oh, our group is good or has the right things, and the other group or the other tool or the other thing is wrong and the enemy. And then self-authoring mind is more where you realize that you can rewrite these sort of narratives for yourself, that they're not fixed, and take responsibility for how your life goes.
So much of this is so relevant and so alive for me, but I have zero comment on it. But this, like, yeah, this whole thing of not having enough frame breaks or something like that, not getting frame broken in the way you perceive the world and proceeding, you know, like you said, in the socialized mind. Like I'm thinking about that. What is it that, and you guys have kind of answered it, I think, it causes us to point the finger at the other. I think you've kind of said it, Yuvi, just there. Yeah, there's so much kind of processing from this.
Oh, I was going to say something. Am I even, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I thought of the Adi Shanti quote. Adi Shanti quote. God is
Adi Shanti.
Thank you. God is unconscious. And it makes it really hard for me because I think, but then I think in a in rivalry, you lose, but then in anti-rivalist, you're going to lose. That's the difficult thing that I've been working on. I've been, you know, if I do something that's anti-rivalrous, it seems like I end up with the shitty end of the stick. But if I do something that's rivalrous, well, then you're really being a competitor. But if this quote is right, oh, God is unconscious, well, then it's both. So that's what I was thinking about.
There's a book I read that kind of, I was working through that problem for a while. Like, how do I change how I operate in my business and in my life to be non-competitive? And it's called Blue Ocean Strategy. Have you read that? It's basically this idea that you can start your own market. Like, you can do something so unique and so unique to you that you don't have competitors. And I really...
Yeah, I don't read, so I'm visually impaired, and talking books make me fall asleep. So blind people need verbal cues. I just listen to everything. I don't read. So I guess if I do get an audio book, I'm not sure which one, where do I start? I don't know. So sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't really know. If you can
Blue
get an
Ocean
audiobook for
Strategy?
Blue Ocean Strategy, that would be good. I think that's the right. I mean, that in the same kind of contemplation of this problem, that actually helped me.
Wasn't The Purple Cow by Seth Godin kind of the same idea?
Yeah, I think so. There's a ton of kind of businessy entrepreneurial books related to this.
Basically, be unique, be yourself, and you won't need to compete very much, at least at first. You get a head start. Essentially,
yeah. Yeah, or just narrow into what you do best. Like, you know, I've been asked the question, and we get compared a lot to Rebel Wisdom, and we talk to each other a lot too. And it's like we're even though we're talking a lot about the same subjects and interviewing the same people, we're like leaning into where we do things differently. So even though there's a twinge of some kind of like, you know, are we covering the same ground? It's like, well, no, if you just keep kind of leaning into that, it just always seems to manifest into something unique on both sides.
So the other thing about the the lecture today was he talked about fundamentalism, and I thought about the Course in Miracles, where it seems that people who participate in the Course of Miracles on the Christian fundamental side have that transcendence thing going on more than I think somebody who wouldn't. So that was the other thing that I thought of.
Do you mean that this particular book would speak to Christian fundamentalists more than other people?
Yeah, like if somebody who was stuck in that mind frame were to participate in that Course in Miracles, it seems like it has that non-duality thing within it. So.
That's interesting. I've tried to engage with the Course in Miracles a couple of times, and I started off with it's interesting. I started off with a fairly allergic reaction, kind of a skeptical reaction towards Christianity. It was like the authoritarian aspect of that. Like, I think that I detected in adults a sense of some kind of what's the word? They don't believe what they say. Whatever the word is that they're being, yeah, but I can't remember the word right now. But
is
anyway,
it like embodiment?
No, it's more like the when I say something, but I mean something else. You know, when I'm being disingenuous about, you know, and there's a word for that. Anyway,
do you mean like in a performative sense?
Self-righteousness.
That too. There's something actually, and it's really fascinating because I noticed my own relationship with self-righteousness. So there is something that has that, and it's a notion that, wow, you don't really believe what you're saying, and yet you're like, truly, you don't, like, you're saying, like, oh, here's the thing. It's like from my perspective now, I can look back and say, you believe what you're saying as long as you stay in the propositional. But when you get to the actual participatory, you don't believe what you're saying. Like, there's something really odd that what you're doing is counter to, you know, your beliefs don't match your actions.
Are you thinking hypocrisy?
Yeah, that's the word that is.
That's exactly the gap of bullshit that Vervaeke talks about, where the propositional doesn't match the participatory. So people's actual experience of something doesn't match their ideas about that thing.
Jordan Peterson had a great lecture about this too, about detecting when you're saying bullshit, when you're not speaking the truth. He had this voice in the back of his head. And it's, I think when you kind of start out with that, it's just some sort of very vague, subtle feeling of like, oh, that doesn't fit. Or like you can kind of feel when you're off of the truth. But he said as he listened to it more, he got more in tune with it, and he just stopped saying anything that wasn't true.
Actually, it
this reminds me of a book. Sorry, go
ahead. No, you go.
Okay, so this also reminds me of a book from Steven Pinker that's called The Sense of Style. And it shares, like, in our modern society, how people, like how big organizations obscure their language so common people cannot understand it. And when I read that, I understood, I saw the announcements from Federal Reserve, and I noticed how much obscurity there is. And even to the simple concepts, they communicate maybe 2 sentences in 2 pages of whole obscure words, and which wouldn't make sense to anyone unless they really sit down and decrypt it.
Mm-hmm. I find legal language is often riddled with a ton of that as well. It's a hustle. Yeah. It's a hustle. It's an elitist fucking hustle. It pisses me the fuck off. But I have to watch it because I was raised very articulate, so I can fall into it as well, though. It's a double-edged, you know.
This relates back to
the contextual thing.
this relates back to the perception that there are like evil men behind the shadows pulling the strings. Because if we can all accidentally fall into that kind of doublespeak language, and it's actually hard to detect when we're, yeah, I mean, if that feeling is very subtle and we haven't practiced it, then it can feel like people are doing it on purpose, but they're not.
Yeah, maybe it's more of an expert thing where it's people within their expert vocabulary of their specialty, and they're forgetting it's the second part of the Dunning-Kruger. Okay, I'm guessing most of us know the Dunning-Kruger thing, where people that don't know enough to know what they don't know, becoming very competent and so on. But the second half that doesn't get talked about very much is people that are expert in something, presuming that other people know what they know, and therefore not putting enough emphasis. And, you know, this strikes me as another case where they might use vocabulary they presume other people understand. And, you know, it comes down to a context thing and being aware that other people don't live in our heads. And when we call an image to mind, we're having to translate that to people and consider their context rather than them seeing just what we've brought up. You know, this awareness of a degree of separateness in our fellow human beings, that everybody's unique and that they don't just have the same picture. You know, they might have a similar experience, but draw their own thing from it.
Yeah, I think there are two things going on here. Like, there would be intentional obscurity and there is unintentional obscurity. And I think both have their reasons. So for unintentional, you could say, I am an engineer, but I'm also writing a technical manual meant for, say, non-technical people. I wouldn't understand how to communicate, but there are institutions out there who are using it to their edge. So that will be intentional obscurity in that case. And I think Steven Pinker touches the idea on both the concepts in this book.
What I think
there's
is
also something to think about is that sometimes people think they know what they're talking about. For example, if they're experts, let's say a lawyer, and they're very well versed in legalese, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they really believe on a participatory level what they're saying. And I mean, you wouldn't necessarily say that lawyers are the most fulfilled people. Like, that sort of expertise can actually be used to deceive ourselves, you know? And in fact, I would say this sometimes, I don't even know if experts are any less likely to deceive themselves, because if they're really smart and they have a really complex framework for something, they think they know it, but it might be completely false on a participatory level. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I've seen it in business quite a lot, where people will look rather at what is possible to get away with rather than what is right to do. And they see things too much in terms of what is possible in an exchange without setting any moral boundaries. I think that's kind of similar to what you've laid out.
That brought to mind something from the Very Bad Wizards podcast, named after the Wizard of Oz thing. You know, I'm not a bad man. I'm just a very bad wizard. You know? And they, at one point in one of the podcasts some time ago, referred to some studies that related to something I'd kind of noticed myself, in that some of my like academically brightest friends are the most religiously dogmatic when it comes to like socio-political stances and such. And it seems like that extraordinary rational ability that gets turned on to, you know, PhD chemistry or whatever it might be, also gets turned into rationalization when it comes to something that they have like group tribal affiliation with, you know?
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And it can be on any number of things. Like Mike brought up moral issues, you brought up group tribalism, but it could be about anything. It could be, you know, somebody who is very knowledgeable in one area thinking that it just makes them a superior human being in general.
You know,
I call that engineer syndrome.
Yeah. I watched this video the other day where a physicist was looking at a series of ads from Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop Labs thing. I don't know if you guys have heard of that, but it's just like pretty, I don't know, it's pretty
Goopy.
goopy. Yeah, there's not a lot of hard science going on there, let's just say that. But you know, he was really struggling to be critical, even though he's like, one thing they talk about a lot is energy. But he's also, the physicist was recognizing, like they would talk about energy moving through the body, and they've got some therapist there that will like help move energy through the body. And he's like, what energy? Like thermal, what? Like, give me a name of what energy. And in being so kind of amped up on his own superior knowledge, he's failing to see the kind of weaknesses in language and the other uses for language that people are having in that situation. And I found that he did kind of admit to that partway through, and then so many of his arguments broke down when it was based off of how people are using language, not are they being, you know, true to the physics, you know. So there's this kind of underlying theme here I keep seeing of benefit of the doubt, or rule omega, like understand that people have their own unique experiences and may not know how to communicate them very well, and may have something valid in their own experience.
Exactly. That's what I was just going to say, that a lot of people may not have the language, the vocabulary, or the framework to explain what is happening, but they might have a hands-on knowledge and experience on how to do something. For example, physiotherapists being able to just like look at a person and say, oh, you have a problem in this part of the body.
Yeah.
You know, they just from experience, they're able to see that.
Yeah.
There's something really fascinating about I love this notion. So there's a couple of things coming together. One of them is that again, just to say, rule omega for me is more than giving the benefit of the doubt. It's actually testing my assumption, right? I'm not saying, let me just assume they know what they're talking about. It's like, why am I confused? Why can I not hear what they're saying? What assumptions am I making? Can I feel where the blockage in me is occurring by listening more deeply to myself in order to try to understand where they're coming from? And it's interesting because as we start to look at Hansi Freinock and metamodernism, and also the Donald Hoffman in The Case Against Reality, very astute, intelligent people who can verbalize a lot of this will inflame people so they can get physicists and economists to start talking like flat earthers, right? No, but you don't understand, it just is. And it's a very funny kind of a notion that it's like, oh, clearly you can see that this person can not only reverbalize what you're saying, but steelman it better than you can, and still disagrees with you. Maybe you want to listen a little more closely to what you're not hearing. And it's something interesting, like in the notion of, somebody was recently on a Reddit thread was talking about whether or not Donald Hoffman is correct that evolution doesn't have us see reality natively, it has a see-fittedness, and it's like it's against this notion of what reality is, and Vervaeke talks about this as well. What are the layers of knowing, and what is reality? But he talks about it in such a way that someone says, you know what, that's kind of ridiculous. I mean, really, with our instruments and with different ways that mathematics, we now understand a pretty sizable chunk of the universe. And I thought, okay, let's actually investigate that thought. Like, we know that we're limited by the speed of light to how far to the edge of the universe we can see. We don't know what lies beyond that. But let's just forget that part of it. Let's just look at the part that we do know about. Even of that, we know that only 3% of it can we account for due to light interactions. The other part is dark matter and dark energy. Okay, so 97% we don't have any idea what the hell is going on. Of the 3% that we do know, we know that it's 99.99999% empty space. So we're down to a very tiny fraction. And of the stuff that we can see and do recognize, scientists are saying most of it's junk. So it's like, wow, do we really understand a sizable chunk of what's going on? I don't think we do. And if we look at it as in terms of the particles are the things that are real and the relationships are just kind of ephemeral or ad hoc, like there's another perspective that it's perhaps the relationships that are more real, and the nodes that are arising are the secondary things. And it's like, yeah, we have a lot to go towards in terms of possibly understanding. And in a way, it bringing this all back, there's a sense in which we are sort of in a larval or nymph stage, right? If I think that as a dragonfly nymph swimming around in some pond, hey, we've completely understood the pond. We understand everything about the universe. And then one day, I recognize I can't breathe water anymore. My physiology is changing. I crawl to the top of a stalk and transform into a dragonfly. And now, oh, the universe is very different than what I thought before. It has a whole lot of relationships of things that are happening that I had no access to. And I think that we're in that sort of, that is the case of the liminal space of finding that between the nymph mode and the dragonfly mode of waking up.
Sometimes I hear things and my brain gets stuck, so this might be taking us back a little bit in the conversation, but something somebody said brought up an article that I'd been pointed to recently, and it's expecting short inferential distances, and it's the idea that when we lived in tribes that were Dunbar size, everyone had the same knowledge. So when somebody came in with new information, it was assumed everyone had the same base level of knowledge. And so, like, getting somebody from where they were to that next step didn't take going back and re-explaining all of the base things that were required to come to that assumption. And so when we're talking to like the expert physicist, it's like there's a huge map that he's got in his head that that he may be assuming that the other person doesn't have. And this article mentions, you have to meet your audience, and there's only so many steps you can do. That's one of the things I liked about John's series is he went back all the way back to his, to the very beginning and bringing us with him. And it's taking 50 hours. Like, not enough. I don't think that's happening as much, and being able to go on that journey and I haven't participated in the conversations with you guys up to this point, but I have watched all the episodes up to this point. And so it's like coming in, I know we all have a similar base of knowledge, and so then when we're coming in and having these conversations, we're not having to make all of these jumps and these assumptions. And yet, if I go to have this conversation with somebody that I know in my life who is not into this stuff, I'm like, I have no idea how to explain the last 18 hours to you. I just don't have that. And I'm like, I hate to go, here's a link to a video. And so finding these conversations, there's this relaxation in my body of going, okay, here's a group of people who have the same foundation of information that I do. And so I'm not when I mention something, you understand the context, and then it doesn't mean, so then it's not like I have to justify how I got to that. And I think so much of the conversation we're having now is justification. And I'm reminded of I stay off Twitter most of the time, but I was trying to direct message somebody, and so I had to go on there, and I saw something, and I felt compelled to walk down that rabbit hole, which is never a fun thing to do. But there was somebody who said, how could you come to any other conclusion? And it was like, because there are other people who have different, it was like somebody was just that was flat out what they said. They're like, you must be being you're purposely being stupid or obtuse if you think that any other conclusion that you could come to any other conclusion. I'm like, that's a person who doesn't have a framework for that. Other people have different life experiences. and so much of the conversation, like so much of the conversations we're trying to have now is like all of the context I bring and all of the context that other people bring. I don't know. There's a lot in that, but it's
Where you were going with that, where so much of the conversation we're trying to have now is having to update each other's models because there's such a huge complexity out there in the world.
Yes.
One thing that keeps coming up, it's like a central theme from all of us and many previous calls, is our desire to have an outcome or like to know for sure or have a binary answer. That keeps coming up. Like it is that certainty of what you maybe haven't quite investigated very deeply that causes you to be aggressive and hard stance and a hard line with other people. There's something so deep in that desire, and I wish I knew what was below it. A desire to, how else can I explain it? Maybe Yuvi help me out because we've had so many discussions about this. The desire for things to be a certain way, to be right, to know, the desire to know, that's a big one.
I think it's somewhat a desire to ward off fear.
Yeah.
You know, it's projecting on others to protect yourself from your own existential dread. You know, it's looking into the abyss and being chilled to your toes.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, it's
Exactly.
the discomfort that comes with not knowing. It's really avoidance of that more than anything. Discomfort of ambiguity. Yeah, well said. And that's become so simple. Like to me, this is so much of this conversation is so much more complicated than it needs to be. There is so much simplicity underneath of it if we could just learn to be a little more comfortable with ambiguity and not knowing and recognizing that type of ignorance that I probably don't know most of everything. And what I think I know, I probably also don't know. Like that's
beginner mind.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of a conversation that I heard between John Vervaeke and Jordan Hall, where they were talking about using AI that like most of the differences in these conversations is where people are at in their development, and if we could use AI to create a translation to between where people are at in their development, so that like if I'm saying something like I'm in the middle of watching Star Trek Voyager, and so I'm thinking of the universal translator. If like I had a universal translator and I said something and it would automatically convert into the language that person understands. Granted, there's something to be said for the relationship that the trust that you have to build in order to meet somebody where they're at. And sometimes I don't have the patience for it. I want to. I work on cultivating that. And sometimes I'm like, I just want you to understand and I don't want to explain. And because I have to, I'm going to run away from this interaction and go hide.
You know, that reminds me, there's an app called crystalknows.com, and I haven't checked it out recently, but when it came out a few years ago, the idea was that different people explain things differently, and by scanning a few of a person's emails, it would determine what style of communication that person uses, and it would suggest a way to say something to that person that would resonate with them. So like some people use kind of flowery poetic language, and some people are very direct, and some people never say no, and some people are happy to say no. And so like things like that, subtlety, like if a person is harsh or soft in their language, etc. And so that reminds me of what you're saying is like kind of a more sophisticated version of that.
Yeah.
I've seen it suggested to even carry that into paying attention to, does an individual you're trying to communicate with use more visual metaphors or auditory metaphors, or or even the order in which they tend to run those kind of metaphors. You can get a sense of what their embodied thinking is like a little bit and tune into that some and connect on that level. You know, if you're talking to somebody that's like almost purely visual metaphors and they never make an auditory, or, you know, they never talk about whether something smells right to them or not, as always, does it look right to them? You know, you can adapt your own speech that way to try to make a better bridge when you're trying to communicate. That came actually giving credit where credit's due from early Richard Bandler, John Grinder, NLP, like 1970s NLP literature.
I've taken a bunch of NLP classes, and there's also added onto that is there's the meta models that people use. Like, do people sort by distinction, or do they sort by sameness? Do they sort by what's different, or do they sort by what's the same? And there's a bunch of different meta models in terms of how people might think and being able to meet people in that language. But like, sometimes I'm just trying hard enough to regulate my own emotions when I'm talking to somebody else, and it's hard to pay attention to what they're doing.
Breathing techniques have been helping me with that. I think Kira, you might have seen me a few times where I've been in more excitable mode. And I can really get kind of spinning fast, you know, and brainstorming in the moment and get like a little kid just going off on it. And literally reaching to like yoga and meditative practice, kind of like breathing techniques, and applying them in conversation has been helping me lately. Or if I catch myself getting way too amped, I can just kind of like straighten up and start paying attention to my breath from my abdomen and just, you know, pull myself into a more level state some. And it tends to help me open up into my awareness and follow whoever I'm communicating with more, rather than being caught in the internal dialogue so much.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny too, because there's a this is a contrarian view that's specific to my own frame, which is if I start thinking about the possibility. So I'm going to go back to the notion of a universal translator. What I recognize as where I get itchy and a little bit concerned is I actually find the ability to listen into the dissonances in people's ways of meaning as a way of exploring the unknown.
Oh yeah,
it's
totally.
Like, there is a lot there. There's a lot of richness that if we bring it to an apparent clarity, which is effectively what we've done with propositional knowing, we think we know what we're talking about. And then it's like, the spaces between kind of get steamrolled, flattened out, and not listened to. So there's something in that. And it's an interesting notion, because I've come to call this the opposable self theory. You know, opposable versus oppositional is a real interesting frame. I like it, and in particular, I'm now playing with it a little bit more in terms of thinking of finite and infinite games. When I go into a finite game, I want to go into an oppositional mindset, because that's where I'm going to actually learn something. I'm going to learn something by that rivalrous, combative, how am I different from the other? And then in the fruit of that game is an opposable infinite game insight.
Yeah.
Right.
So that
it's
diving in and coming.
Yes, that's touched with me in a conversation with friends about how sometimes a rivalrous activity can feed into a non-rivalrous, you know, overall meta result or something. And and I'm going to rephrase a little to see if I'm actually hearing you right, David. It struck me a little bit as saying, like, instead of contriving a communication bridge, another option is to just put the differences right out there and watch the borders and the shape of where they rub up against each other. I'm getting visual metaphors of people in like machining practices where they put dye on something and rub two parts together and look where the dye rubs off, and then they go and refine. And okay.
Yeah.
David, can you elaborate a little? You said, go on.
Go ahead.
You said you enter when you're entering a finite game and you enter with a contrarian mindset. Can you elaborate what you meant by that?
What I mean is that if I go, I'll give the example as a very simple one, and you can make it more complex. But the simple version is, if I'm playing chess with my son, and I want to make sure that he has a good time, I may not try to beat him. I'll just like play in a way that's not really rivalrous. But he hasn't learned anything. If he thinks he's beat me because I'm not playing well, then I'm actually training him to be weak in that. And if I do the same thing, if I want to try to be nice in the game. Let's all be friends in Monopoly. Nobody buy out of the hotels. Let's just see if we can make the game last as long as it. Okay, well that's a kind of a game, but I don't actually learn the transactional kind of skill set that might be afforded to me in the game by really going at it aggressively. Same thing with playing basketball, right? If we're just going to play basketball and we're not keeping score, everybody's just shooting and it doesn't really matter and sides and whatever, we're just having a good time. By not being too rivalrous, by not being so focused on, okay, what is this? What are we trying to do? And I'm actually trying to defeat you in order to learn the boundaries of myself. There's something of that I want to go at that fully. And I there may be something, right? I do want to get the right level. I don't want to go and play basketball against somebody who's just going to beat me every time. But I also don't want to only play people that I can beat, right? I really want to find that edge. Where can I most learn about myself by being at that edge of my capacity?
I'm hanging on your chess example a bit. In that, when I find myself in those situations, like trying to play a game with a kid like that and wanting to keep it real, but also keep them connected and involved as well, and recognize the skill difference, as I run this extra recursive loop where it's like, okay, if we're doing it with cards, it's easier to model in a card game where you literally just lay down your hands. You ever teach somebody a card game with the hands open? And you're going through and you're talking your best strategy and you're explaining why you're making your moves. You can do that in the chess game too. Be like, okay, think about it before you moved. I did that for a reason. Like, what reason might that be? And you can engage on that strategy level and still play, bring your good game, but at the same time, include them in a learning process rather than just, to cap it and go spike the football. Yeah.
This is so funny. This is like, once again, one of the most advanced kind of explorations of this middle ground where like optimal challenge and fun are playing together is coming in with video games. And this game I've been playing a lot of. It's called Apex Legends, and it's like a big shooter game where 60 people drop down into an island, and then the last one to survive wins. And there's so many players, and they want to keep it challenging, so they do this thing called skill-based matchmaking, where every time, like, basically you're only playing against people that are within a range of your skill, and everyone hates it. Like, the whole community hates it, and they say this is ruining the game, because every time they level up a little bit, they're suddenly matched with people exactly at that level, and level up a little bit, matched. They can never feel like they're getting better at the game, and I feel the same way. It's so frustrating. But when I go back, if I like reset my account and go back to where I started from, I'm easily dominating, wiping the floor with everybody. It's really funny. You don't see your progress over time, but they have to like ride this line, and it's so difficult, and their algorithm to sort this out is so complex. It's so difficult to keep people enjoying the process, and they're obviously like trying to get you into this flow where the challenge and your competence are matched up, but man, it's so challenging.
Yeah,
I'm reminded of Jordan Peterson and talking about the rats playing, and that if you don't let the smaller rat win at least 30% of the time, they'll just give up and not keep playing. And so how do you find that exactly? How do you find that balance and of like with a little one, keeping them challenged and it being real, and yet at the same time keeping, not letting them, or not creating a situation where they're just going to give up because it's beyond their skill level. And there's I think that's just such an interesting thing. And the how somebody mentioned in the chat of, I now know that being a parent is creating an environment for serious play, or something to that effect. Somebody said that. And how do you do that in the it's like, how do you do that in these conversations? How do you create play in these conversations when it's like people come into them with it's life or death stakes? And Yeah, it's just a.
I feel you on that because I felt like there's an too much emphasis put on the apocalyptic possibilities sometimes. That like I hate to say it, like it's something. Okay, this is something I do in my own for myself, but it's not something I feel I could like really I could suggest to others, but not ask of them. you know. I've tied it into with like acceptance of death as an individual. Like odds are it's gonna happen at some point. A meteorite could come through my roof right now. We could all have a very surprising experience. you know? So the idea, accepting the possibility of failure, not as an excuse not to try, but just simply being real and accepting the possibility of failure. And taking that to a huge human species level of like, yeah, maybe we don't get it right and we become the dinosaurs to something else a few million years from now. Like, well, at least we tried, and there's some solace in accepting that to where it takes some of the, I'm remembering Adam Savage from Mythbusters fame, talking about being in a car where they were testing the escape from a sinking car in a lake scenario. And he was there underwater in the dark in a car and he lost his regulator. And he had a moment. There was a diver in the back seat somewhere, but it was dark and he didn't know exactly where. And he had this moment where he started to panic. And then this voice, this inner part of his being spoke in his mind, relaxed lives, stressed dies. And he calmed himself and found a regulator and got a breath of air, and he's still with us. I've misparaphrased that slightly, but that's the gist of it. Tense dies, relaxed lives. And if I think,
damn.
Oh. Isn't that always the way?
Yeah. Some brilliance was uttered that humanity is now robbed of forever.
Kevin just tensed too much at the wrong moment.
I just wanted to ask, how long do you guys usually go to? What time do you guys usually go until?
It's usually an hour, but sometimes we go over. Yeah.
Okay.
So we're pretty much.
I do have to wrap.
Yeah.
I do have to hop out in a few minutes, but I just.
It was good to have you. I mentioned at the beginning we're thinking of maybe doing this a little less frequently, like twice a month instead of every week. Just we've got so much other stuff going on. So
and the baby.
Yeah, I think what we'll do is probably the first Monday and the second Monday and the fourth Monday of every month, right? Yeah, we'll do this. So there's a calendar that you guys can check out at futurethinkers.org/events. I hope Nev has updated that. Yeah, futurethinkers.org/events, and you can see, and we'll update like all of the events on there, because we do discussions like 3 times a week.
Some of them are members only, but some of them are not.
Yeah.
So there was some talk, Mike, about the possibility that I could host or somebody else might host. Do you want to continue where you're always participating so that we do it with a less frequent?
Yeah, I mean. Yeah, we should talk about how to do that because there's some technical limitations, but I've been exploring that and I think I've got some solutions. So if you wanted to host them, continue doing it every week, you could totally do that. Is that something you want to do?
Yeah, I would. It's interesting. I like the pace of once a week.
Yeah.
And I think that I'd be concerned that people might drop off. Yeah. But I'd also be open to. I'm curious. I don't know what other people's sense is. Of the people on the call today, what's your sense of weekly or every other week being an appropriate time scale?
I think weekly is good.
Weekly is good?
Although it's my first call. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of firsts today. It's weird. And he's back.
And I still see his frozen face.
Yeah. So okay.
You're muted, Kevin.
I don't know how it's done exactly, but I think the pace of every week is good. Otherwise, I think 50 episodes takes almost a year and a half.
Yeah. Yeah. We did the math, and it's 8 months to get to 50 from now. Yeah. At once a week. Okay, so David, we'll just be in touch about when, if UV and I need to miss some. Like today would have been a day we probably would have missed, and it's just when we're pushing ourselves like that, it's a little hard. So I'll just be in touch with you to make sure that you can host it.
Yeah, I need to get some technical stuff on my side set up, but yeah, let's talk about it and make sure that I could do it, and then once that's set up, I'll be happy to. Actually, I can just remote set it up for you. That can be easy. Okay. It's all free. Cool. Okay, cool. Yeah, I guess we should kind of wrap it up then. Oh, Kevin, was it? You got cut off like right at the kind of crescendo of that.
Yeah. Sometimes I was on my cell phone and Zoom just like hard crashes it occasionally, like full reboot. And it seems funny enough to often happen when I'm trying to go off on a roll of some sort. Like I feel like some sort of universal editor kicking in sometimes as far as that goes. While I got the mic, so to speak, I'm new. This is my first time joining one of these future thinker chats like this. Like if anybody wants to catch me up on like the typical formats, is there a chat group somewhere we can connect with? Like,
yeah,
I would love to have.
We do Discord.
More spontaneous conversations with these folks.
We do Discord, and you can check that out at futurethinkers.org/Discord. I think. I'm just gonna check that link. Yeah, I don't know why we haven't promoted this before because it's actually growing quite a bit on its own. It's a great platform for chat. And then
I like it.
I just mentioned we do a lot of other calls. We do three calls a week roughly. We're gonna change our schedule.
Podcast interviews plus meetups.
Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff that you can check out. Some of it's paid, but you can check that out at the members area on the site, members.futurethinkers.org. Yeah, and that the fees actually just help us do more of this and make this kind of a full-time thing. So it's going somewhere productive for the community. But yeah. Thank you all the new people for joining us this week. This was fun. Yeah, nice to see some fresh blood.
Yeah, and just thank you, Mike and Yuvi, for putting in so much work to make this all happen. Like, I really appreciate what you guys are doing.
Thanks. Yeah.
And Yuvi, thanks for your suggestion. I love that crystalnose.com app. I think it'll be useful in business.
Cool.
And I just wanted to, somebody else posted in the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Facebook group that there's another group it's not hosted publicly, but it's another discussion group where there's people all over the world that are participating in it, and it's starting today. And so at 4:30 Pacific time, you kind of fill out something and they match you with a group. But it sounds like there's a bunch of different groups that are all happening doing the same thing. So I don't know, it sounds like it's not being hosted publicly or anything like that. So just to put that out there, if anybody else was interested in participating, especially in this type of, talking about the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series.
Oh, that brings up another thing. We're going to have people come in and host workshops in our memberships area. And I've got a call scheduled with John tomorrow to talk about what he would want to do for a workshop. It would probably be 4 separate calls going on for about a month, once a week. And we're going to do we've already done one Q&A with him in this community. We might kind of do a little more of that and extend the conversation since there's so much to discuss. I think he teaches meditation, among other things. So if you guys have any ideas or things you would love to have John cover in those workshops, then let us know. Because now would be the time to discuss that, because we have a call with him tomorrow night. Yeah.
I do have to hop up, so Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining.
Look forward to participating in the future.
Cool.
Thank you.
Be well, Kier.
Alexander, I know you may have some thoughts about. I definitely think that the conversation that Alexander and I have been having on pretty much a weekly basis is more about bringing about the ecology of practices, how to kind of get that started. In a sense, it's funny. I always give a little bit of pushback. I don't want it to be overly defined. I kind of want it to be exploratory and discover and a process of discovery. It's an interesting aspect is these kind of watch parties. I think I was talking to a friend of mine. This is a kind of church in a way. It's almost like it requires a kind of a watching the material and engaging in it in a way that is participatory. And it like Kira said earlier, it enables it affords a kind of conversation with people have similar background and frame that's not possible if somebody hasn't had these as a frame. I know people who know philosophy up and down sideways and can't engage in some of the nuance of these conversations.
I've got so much more to share than I'm realizing. Speaking of ecology of practice, I had a call with John last week or 2 weeks ago, and we were discussing how to visualize an ecology of practice. And I think I can share this document with you guys.
I like that term. That's the first I've heard.
Yeah.
Of practice, and that
Practices.
I've been groping for something. Practices, an ecology of practices, because I've had a lot of thought recently about trying to fill the niche, the gaps that are left after our, Nietzsche's death of God, so to speak, and trying to fill that gap. And ecology of practices is such a beautiful phrase for it.
Okay. So
it's a singular in the doc here, but.
You know what? Sorry to the people on the stream. I don't think I can actually do this quite yet. I wasn't kind of prepared. So I will have to show these guys. So maybe we'll just end the stream right now, and I'll show you guys the document. And yeah, we'll be back next week, same time. If anyone wants to participate in the Ecology of Practice document brainstorm, jump onto the Zoom call right now. And I'll be discussing it there. We'll just end the stream. So that's futurethinkers.org/discuss. So thanks for joining, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.